A single-engine blur crossed beneath the cloud line at 8,200 feet. Its engine already hot, its fuel already light. The pilot, an unarmed photo recon flyer, had 16 seconds before being spotted. 9 Mitsubishi A6M0s were inbound from 11,500 feet, climbing at 290 miles per hour in a loose echelon spread. The math was lethal. He had no guns, no escort. And at this altitude, the enemy would descend on him with a 3,000-foot advantage and the sun behind them. Standard operating procedure was clear dive, break visual, run. But Lieutenant Frank Hayward didn't dive. He didn't run. He climbed. Slowly, deliberately. No jink, no evasive action. It was the opposite of every page in the flight manual. Because Hayward wasn't trying to win. He was trying to be seen. And not just by the Zeros. 6 miles away and climbing hard. 3 F-6F Hellcats were holding a formation that made no sense, ascending on a near-vertical line into a kill zone that hadn't even been confirmed. Their lead was banking on one fact that Hayward would stall out, pretend to panic, and pull every Zero with him. That wasn't in any Navy doctrine. It was suicide. And still, they waited. Manual called this behavior reckless endangerment of recon assets. Then Hayward popped smoke, and the trap began. They called him the accountant. Not out of affection, out of mockery. Lieutenant Frank Hayward didn't drink. He didn't joke. He corrected math on flight boards with a pencil he carried behind his ear. He was 24, wore regulation glasses, and could recite aircraft fuel burn rates by memory. During training at Pensacola, he logged the highest written score in his class and the second worst gunnery mark. His instructor wrote, "Not a fighter," assigned to Recon. His classmates called him Safe Bet Frank. He was assigned to fly the F-6F-5P, a photo recon variant of the Hellcat. No guns, just a trim camera bay, stripped weight, and 270-mile cruise at 12,000 feet, at 12 bar. Its climb rate was strong, 2,300 feet/min, but it was never meant to engage. Pilots were ordered to avoid all combat zones, maintain a 60-mile minimum distance from reported fighter patrols, and never provoke pursuit. The logic was simple: photos win campaigns. Lose a recon plane, lose targeting data. Frank followed orders. Until he didn't. On June 3rd, 1945, over the northern Philippines, Frank filed a path 40 miles closer than authorized. No weapons, no wingman. Command signed off, unaware of what the route intersected. Hayward had cross-referenced Japanese return flight trends from the last 3 days. He'd identified a window exactly 0842 to 0855, where at least one squadron of Zeros transited west, low on fuel and unready for combat. Nobody asked him to plan an ambush. Nobody trained recon pilots to coordinate with fighters. But Frank had radio codes. He had climb profiles memorized. And he had 3 Hellcat pilots bored, reckless, and willing to test the idea. He told them one line over the radio: "If they chase me, don't miss." Recon Command never heard the call. The standing policy remained: do not provoke, do not engage, do not loiter. Frank was in violation of all 3 by 0844. Then something happened he hadn't planned. 9 Zeros, not 6. Their altitude, 11,500, not 9,000. And their spread wasn't loose. They flew in coordinated 3-element formation, fanned and ready. His margin vanished in under 10 seconds. The cameras were already rolling. The 3 Hellcats were already committed. And Frank was 1,000 feet too low for what came next. He had one shot to get them to follow, and he knew exactly how to fail in just the right way. But then one of the Zeros broke early, at 0850, and everything unraveled faster than his plan could adapt. Navy reconnaissance doctrine in 1945 was built on 2 words: avoid contact. Recon pilots weren't hunters. They were eyes. The entire Pacific theater depended on their photo supply routes, artillery positions, airfield status, weather over the next island. The cost of losing one wasn't just a plane, it was days of bombing data, targeting adjustments, and scheduling. So the orders were strict. Recon aircraft were never to linger, never to draw fire, and never to alter flight patterns once over enemy territory. The mantra drilled into every unarmed pilot at Pearl Harbor's intel wing was simple: shoot nothing, scare nothing, survive everything. Frank Hayward read those words in every briefing. He also ignored them. Not out of arrogance, but out of logic. Every recon path was predictable. Every pilot flew it by the book, and the Japanese had learned it. In 3 months, 0 pilots had downed 5 Navy recon planes, not with ambushes, but by simply guessing where they'd be. The pattern was clear: fly recon long enough, and the enemy would catch on. Frank proposed a reversal. Instead of avoiding contact, invite it. Instead of fleeing early, pull them deeper. He called it reverse geometry. Nobody listened. His F-6F-5P had no guns, no armor, and no backup fuel tank. Its only advantage was speed in descent and deceptive climb. That was enough. He designed a plan where his flight path would deliberately drift 18 miles past the no-go boundary. That put him directly along a route used by returning Japanese fighter patrols based out of Luzon. The hope wasn't to avoid them, it was to meet them, just late enough in their patrol that they were low on ammo and fuel. Then bait them with what looked like a crippled recon pilot making a last-ditch run for it, to the enemy. It would appear perfect, a lone camera craft, already descending with nowhere to run. But the descent wasn't real. It was a tempo trick. Frank practiced it over 6 nights in May, trimming power until the engine stuttered just enough to appear damaged, then throttling back to feign fuel starvation. He even learned to cut off one magneto to make his prop arc stutter just long enough to invite the kill. He wrote the entire tactic in a folded sheet labeled "Not for Use." It stayed in his locker. Then came June 3rd. Command assigned him a routine sweep. He adjusted the course by 18 degrees, extended the loop by 23 miles, and filed his report after launch. By the time control noticed, he was already 41 miles past the safety line. But something else happened he hadn't calculated. The Zeros didn't just appear. They formed up tightly, deliberately, and with radio coordination. At 0850, he realized they weren't being baited. They were hunting something already, and he was in the exact center of their closing fan. Frank leveled at 8,200 feet and trimmed his throttle to maintain 265 mph, just enough to stay stable without climbing further. To his right, the Pacific horizon burned pale against cloud breaks. Behind him, 9 Zeros, closing in from 11,500 feet at 290 ma. They held an offset angle 30-degree on high left with a 200-yard lateral spread. Frank's rear camera caught the formation in perfect symmetry. What looked like disarray was actually geometry. They were boxing him. The altitude gap was 300 feet. At a 15 degrees descent, the Zeros would cover it in under 16 seconds. Closure speed, 25 mph vertical, 290 horizontal. Time to impact zone, 22 seconds. Frank didn't turn. He didn't jink. He wanted them to think he hadn't seen them. That meant no rudder movement, no lift correction, and no signal. The recon camera inside his F-6F-5P clicked every 1.5 seconds. The Zeros had not fired yet. That was unusual. Normally, the lead would open with a warning burst to panic the target. But these pilots didn't fire. They maintained their formation, easing into an arc just above his 6 o'clock. Frank noted it with quiet precision. Their hesitation meant they still believed he might not be alone. He counted under his breath, 1,001, 1,002. At 11, the lead Zero twitched, not to fire but to hold. They were waiting for him to move. If Frank turned, the 2 wingmen would roll into a high-speed pincer. If he dove, The lower element, now visible at 7,400 feet, would slice upward and trap him. If he climbed, he'd stall out under their angle and become a silhouette. He was boxed on a three-plane grid. The geometry left only one irrational option: slow down. Frank did something no doctrine allowed. He tapped the trim forward, reduced power by 6%, and flattened his glide. He wanted to appear confused, not outmaneuvering them, just unsure. Maybe even damaged. Something not worth gunning down fast. Something you follow. The Zeros began closing formation, now 800 yards. Altitude separation shrank to 2,000 feet. Frank's Hellcat was a speck below them, no threat, no firepower, just a drifting Recon flyer off course. But above them, 7 miles to the west, and rising, 3 Hellcats shifted from line to wedge. Frank had 10 seconds left before visual convergence. He tapped his left rudder pedal just enough to show wobble. A mistake. The lead Zero tilted. The camera caught it. That was the signal they needed. The fan formation compressed. And the pincer began. Frank's window was closing fast. Frank's choices had narrowed to 2, and neither was safe. If he held course, the lead Zero would lock guns in 6 seconds, from a descending position with full line of sight. If he dove, he'd accelerate too fast for the Hellcats to time their intercept, losing the bait advantage. The plan was to hold just long enough. But just was now down to 3 seconds. The first tracer lines ripped past his left stabilizer at 0850-42. The lead Zero had fired short. Warning bursts testing his nerve. Frank rolled right, not fast, just 5 degrees, then back. Not enough to evade. Enough to appear panicked. A sudden burst of black smoke trailed from his cowling intentional. He'd richened the fuel mix before the flight. It made the engine cough on throttle drop. He yanked it now. The black streak billowed. To the Zeros, it meant engine hit, pilot desperate. They surged forward. This was the wrong move. Recon pilots were trained never to simulate damage. It invited attack. Frank had just painted a target on himself, and it worked. The 3 front Zeros broke their shallow dive and poured on throttle. Their leader tucked to 290 push, engine whine peaking. Altitude now 8,700 feet and falling. Frank counted them 1, 2, 3, and now they were fully committed. The rear 2 Zeros maintained the box, but the top left elements had peeled away to flank. That was their mistake. They thought he was alone. From the west, at 11,000 feet, the Hellcat trio began to roll. Their leader barked a call, green 3, down 2-0, and split the formation. One dove shallow to mask. The others held vertical for 6 more seconds. Frank heard nothing. His radio was off. It had to be. His role was bait, not command. He flew blind, trusting that the line would hold. At 0850-49, the Zeros opened full fire. Frank's right aileron shattered. His bird shuddered. Altitude dropped to 700 to 600 feet. He slammed rudder left and yanked the stick hard. This was not planned, not calculated. His rear quarter was gone, and the only maneuver that would keep him alive was forbidden a reversal stall at low altitude. He pulled anyway. The Hellcats were still 8 seconds out. Frank's Hellcat snapped into a climbing left bank, nose rising past 40 degrees with a stall warning already buzzing. He had just 180 mph of airspeed left below ideal climb threshold, and was bleeding altitude fast. The Zero pilots saw it immediately. To them, it looked like a last-ditch mistake, a panicked rookie trying to loop out of trouble. One of the trailing Zeros even broke formation to follow him up, expecting a stall kill. But Frank's climb wasn't desperate, it was bait. Below, the 2 other Hellcats had silently completed their roll into the attack cone. One held level to cut off escape. The other descended at a 28-degree angle, accelerating from 12,000 feet with full throttle and combat flaps armed. They were just over 6,000 yards away and closing at nearly 400 mph. But the lead Zero didn't see them. None of them did. Frank's wild climb had stolen their focus. The mistake became obvious too late. At 08:51:04, the first Hellcats tracers shredded through the flank Zero's fuselage, ripping its left wing root. The enemy fighter tumbled sideways, spinning at 600 feet per second into a cloud bank. No parachute, no warning. Just gone. Panic fractured the formation. The lead Zero yanked hard right, cutting across Frank's stalled tail. Another broke low, only to be met by the second diving Hellcat that had perfectly predicted the escape arc. They fired simultaneously. The sky flashed white-orange with incendiary sparks. A second Zero disintegrated at 08:51:06. Two down. Frank's aircraft now hung mid-air, airspeed near zero, altitude at 7,100 feet. The stall was real. His control stick kicked back with resistance. He nosed down, praying the Hellcat's nose weight would do the rest. It did. The bird fell forward, wings shuddering, diving back toward the wake of the ambush below. But the enemy was reacting. The remaining Zeros split into two pairs. One set dove hard east, accelerating for escape. The other pair tried to circle wide and regain height. The Hellcat leader knew the signs a trap had become a scramble. They had seconds to finish the job before the kill box dissolved. Frank stabilized at 280 miles per hour in descent and held heading. His rear camera kept clicking. Below him, the fourth Zero caught a full burst from Hellcat number 2 ammo hit. A flash fire erupted from the wing. It spiraled down, trailing black smoke, disappearing at 08:51:11. The fifth Zero made one final error. It rolled left to dive but turned toward Frank, thinking the Recon plane was still the easy kill. It never saw the Hellcat 400 feet above and behind it. A 6-round burst blew its canopy off. 5 Zeros down. And Frank, who'd just stalled, spun, and recovered inside 11 seconds, wasn't done flying yet. But now the 6th Zero climbed vertical directly into Frank's descent line. The 6th Zero had looped out of the chaos below and was now clawing upward in a steep vertical climb. Engine screaming, nose pitched 55 degrees, cutting directly into Frank's descent path. At 08:51:13, the two planes were closing at a combined speed of nearly 510 miles per hour. Neither one had firing solution yet. Frank's Hellcat, recovering from the stall, was diving at a shallow 18 degrees, with airspeed rising past 290 miles per hour. But his instruments were failing. His artificial horizon flickered, and the vertical speed indicator froze at 0. His right rudder pedal felt soft, damage from the earlier burst. He had 2 seconds to react. No guns, no radio, just trajectory. Instinct took over. Instead of breaking left or right moves, the Zero pilot would expect Frank kick the nose slightly up and right, entering a shallow barrel roll. It wasn't clean. His damaged control surfaces bucked. The roll looked more like a tumble. But it was enough. At 08:51:14, the Zero fired. All rounds missed high and wide, tracing behind Frank's twisting fuselage. The Zero kept climbing, but now it had lost too much speed. At 6,000 feet, it stalled. Briefly, enough for Frank to see it flatten, wobble, and begin a lazy right-hand recovery turn. That mistake cost him. The second Hellcat was already arcing in from the south at 310 mph. It saw the stall, cut throttle, and dropped flaps in one fast snap. It fired from 450 yards, tracer fire walked from tail to canopy. The Zero caught fire instantly, peeled right, then nosed into the sea. 6th kill, 08:51:17. Frank exhaled. He was alive, but his Hellcat was barely holding together. Engine oil temp had spiked to 265 degrees. His cowling was coated in carbon soot. Every gauge shook. And worse, the ambush window was closing. The remaining 3 Zeros had vanished into cloud cover at 7,500 feet, heading east. They had speed, altitude, and daylight to reach Luzon. Pursuit was no longer viable. The Hellcat lead called it off RTB full, all elements. Frank never heard it. His radio remained cold. His rear camera caught the final image of the battle, a single Zero tail disappearing into mist, with one wing flashing damage along the spar. That Zero would not make it back. Total engagement time 35 seconds, 6 confirmed kills, 1 assist, 0 casualties. But Frank's role wasn't over. He still had to land a crippled Recon Hellcat, 37 miles from base, with low fuel, 1 stabilizer gone, and full photographic evidence of a tactic that, according to the Navy, was impossible. And command was already waiting with questions. Frank reduced throttle to 65% and nosed gently west, locking course 282 degrees, heading for the closest strip on Leyte, distance 37 miles. Fuel 22 gallons, barely enough for 11 minutes at cruise. Airspeed held at 240 miles per hour, but the aircraft trembled. His starboard aileron linkage was severed. Each correction took extra force, and the stick had a growing delay. Frank had to predict turns before they happened. Behind him, the last 3 Zeros were gone, vanished into high cloud cover, heading east. But the battle wasn't over, not for him. The Hellcat's cylinder head temp read 202, dangerously close to red line. Oil pressure flickered low. His climb-out damage had cost more than stability. It had ripped a seam near the intercooler. The bird was overheating. Standard operating procedure called for a ditch at sea if pressure dropped below 40 psi. Frank had 38. He should have gone down. But if he did, the camera film still running would be lost. That footage wasn't just evidence, it was proof. He had stalled deliberately, baited fighters without weapons, survived. The Navy called that recklessness. Frank called it geometry. At minute 3 of his return flight, altitude dropped to 5,000 feet. That wasn't planned. He tried to climb. Nothing. The Hellcat refused. Max throttle gave him 255 ampere flat. Cooling vent wide open. Still 20 miles to go. Frank ran emergency checks, battery green. Prop pitch stable, but torque was slipping. Worse, his flaps wouldn't fully extend. He tapped the switch twice. Nothing. Manual override clicked once. Jammed. He now had partial flap on one side only. That meant landing would yaw left violently, but he had no time to fix it. At 0859, Frank spotted the strip. North-south layout. Light crosswind from the east at 9 miles. Not ideal, but survivable if he balanced the drift. He dialed trim hard right, held the throttle steady at 2,000 RPM, and began descent. 700 feet. 600. 500. The bird fought him every second, left roll constant. Altimeter dipped fast, 400 feet. He lined up center, nose bobbed at 250 feet. A warning light snapped on hydraulic drop. No gear confirmation. He had to choose pull-up and risk fire, or belly land with the camera still hot. He held course and dropped gear blind. The impact hit at 098 mph. Left skid dragged. Tail yanked right. Ailerons flared. He slammed brakes. The Hellcat twisted. Rolled 20 degrees. Screeched to a halt. Alive. But then 2 officers sprinted toward him. No cheers. No salute. Just one shouted question. "Why were you stalled?" Frank unlatched the canopy but didn't stand. His legs were shaking. The landing had bruised his ribs and locked his back against the seat bulkhead. Smoke from the cowling still hissed across the nose. But he didn't shut the engine. He didn't dare lose battery before the camera offloaded. The 2 officers climbed the wing, faces pale with heat and disbelief. One grabbed the side of the fuselage and pointed at the bent tailplane. "You stalled? Intentionally? In combat?" Frank didn't answer. He reached behind the seat, pulled the film cartridge, and handed it off without a word. The second officer popped the side hatch, ducked in. "You were spotted at 8,200 feet and didn't dive. You lured them." Frank's voice was flat. That was the plan. They stared. Silence. Because there was no such plan in Navy doctrine. Not one. A recon pilot baiting a squadron of enemy fighters into a coordinated pincer ambush wasn't just unorthodox, it was forbidden. Their manual, printed only 6 months earlier, outlined strict recon evasion, avoid contact, radio any shadowing, and flee. Frank had done none of that. But the camera didn't lie. The first playback showed the Zeros converging, 3 cutting shallow, 1 committing vertical. Then tracers from the Hellcat punched the frame, hit, fire, tumble, then again, 5 times in 11 seconds. And Frank's roll. It was visible too. He had climbed while stalling, inverted the Zero's fire line, and survived. The footage caught his black fuel smoke pouring from the cowl voluntary misfire. A fake kill cue, banned in doctrine, deadly in use. And it had worked. The officers didn't yell, they just left. The footage went straight to base command. Within hours, a copy was flown to the USS Lexington, then couriered by sea to Pearl Harbor for analysis. Frank was grounded, temporarily, deemed a safety risk. His name wasn't entered into the day's official kill roster, but off record, among the Hellcat squadron. A phrase started to circulate: recon bait. It was used jokingly at first, but then whispered, then trained. On the edge of the airstrip that night, one of the junior pilots from the attack flight found Frank cleaning the carbon from his engine block. No salute, no briefing, just one question. How did you know the climb would work? Frank didn't look up. I didn't. He glanced at the tool in his hand. Oil-streaked. Bent. I just needed them to think I was alone. He didn't mention the 6-second climb window, or the throttle timing, or the roll angle. Those numbers weren't written anywhere. They couldn't be trained. The tactic hadn't been born in a simulator. It had been born in a mistake. And 2 weeks later, someone else tried it at 10,000 feet over Saipan. The Hellcat that attempted the maneuver over Saipan wasn't flown by Frank. It was Lieutenant James Diller, 23, seasoned, but not reckless. He'd seen Frank's footage, studied the angle, memorized the moment the stall began. Diller's mission was routine escort 3 SBD Dauntlesses crossing open water at 11,200 feet. No contact expected. Then came the call, bandits, high, 10 o'clock, multiple. They were Kai 43 Oscars, lightweight, nimble, and deadly in groups. There were 5. They dove from 14,000 feet at 381 Samara, spreading into attack angles. One aimed straight for Diller's wingman. Diller had 3 seconds to choose turn and engage, or try what he shouldn't. He went vertical. Nose up 42 degrees, throttle back to 72%, no roll, no flare, airspeed dropped from 270 to 210. He didn't fire, didn't turn, just climbed deliberate, exposed, and the Oscars bit. All 5 shifted focus, chasing the rising target they thought had overcommitted. One even radioed, he's stalling. But Diller wasn't stalling. Not yet. At 900 feet, he punched throttle full, dropped nose 11 to 11 degree, and rolled inverted. It wasn't textbook, it was borrowed. The timing was tight. One Oscar fired, missed, another over-rotated and lost visual. At 400 feet, Diller's wingman waiting south, Silent opened fire from 300 yards and scored a direct hit. 1 enemy down. Diller finished his dive, flanked wide, and rejoined formation. No damage, no loss. 2 kills confirmed. Frank's mistake was now a maneuver, and it had a name: Decoy Ascend, unofficial, unrecorded. But pilots started whispering it into their mission briefings because it wasn't just about bait, it was about betrayal, about showing weakness at just the right moment, long enough to make the enemy commit, then collapsing the trap. But not everyone could do it. The climb had to be imperfect, the roll had to lag, the stall warning had to flash, not blare. It wasn't performance. It was performance art. Within 1 month, 2 more Recon pilots tried it. One succeeded. One didn't come home. Command still refused to list the tactic in manuals. No diagrams, no procedures. But a copy of Frank's camera reel circulated between squadrons, shared like contraband. Its nickname, Bait Reel. And in it, frame by frame, instructors taught new cadets how to look helpless. Frank never saw those sessions. He wasn't reinstated, but his Hellcat was recovered, refitted, and used again by a pilot who asked no questions and only said, "Tell me how you stalled." The refitted Hellcat Bureau number 40877 was stripped of Recon markings, repainted in full combat gray, and reassigned to VF-19. Its new pilot was Lieutenant Ray McConnell, 21 no kills yet, but rated top 5% in maneuver assessments. He never met Frank, but he requested one thing before his first sortie: access to the original engine data from the stall run. Maintenance gave it to him in silence. 3 weeks later, on patrol south of Okinawa, McConnell spotted a single Ki-61 Tony tailing a damaged Avenger at 10,500 feet. He had altitude but not angle. Normal approach risked alerting the fighter, so he tried the stunt, climbed to 11,600, banked slowly, dropped throttle to 68%, nose up 35 degrees, let his airspeed fall to 215 p. To any observer below, he was drifting overcommitted, inattentive. The Tony took the bait. It broke from the Avenger and began climbing behind McConnell. At 10,900 feet, Ray cut throttle hard, kicked left rudder and rolled into a shallow spin. From below, it looked like a stall out. The Tony dove for the kill. But Ray's stall was preloaded. He snapped out of it with right aileron, gained 150 feet in 2 seconds, and fired one burst from 480 yards. The 20-millimeter shells walked straight into the Tony's cowling. It lit up and peeled away, trailing black smoke. Confirmed kill, logged at 0733. What stunned observers wasn't just the trick, it was how calm the maneuver looked. On gun camera, it resembled a training loop. No panic, no twitch, just bait and reversal. When command reviewed the footage, the same officer who grounded Frank viewed the reel. He didn't smile. He just signed off with a dry stamp, non-standard engagement result acceptable. But other pilots saw more. Within days, 6 Hellcats practiced controlled climbs during live runs. Not to the full stall, just enough to look like they had no plan. The enemy's response was the same every time: commit early, overextend, get flanked. Even with this success, no formal name was assigned. Still, squadron briefings began to include one line, added in pencil on the margin of sortie sheets: condition bait. Frank's tactic was becoming a field option, but there was no citation, no acknowledgement, and Frank still grounded, still uncredited. His name remained missing from kill logs, his flight hours frozen, until one morning, 2 months later, a courier arrived at his tent with a manila envelope. No rank, no return address. Inside was a still frame from McConnell's kill camera, showing a burning Ki-61 falling away beneath a Hellcat with tail number 40877. On the back, in ink, 5 words: wrong altitude, right idea. Thanks. Frank never flew again. But his trick-faking failure to win advantage was already being copied far from the Pacific. By early 1945, whispers of conditioned bait had spread beyond the Navy. A few Marine squadrons in the Central Pacific began testing their own variants, using F-4U Corsairs instead of Hellcats. The tactic wasn't written anywhere official, but every flight debrief with a successful fake stall engagement added fuel to the fire. One squadron out of Peleliu even ran mock drills, asking rookies to look helpless for 7 seconds before counterclimbing. A new phrase emerged during chalkboard briefings: 7 for heaven. Meant as a joke until it worked twice in 1 week. More surprising was where it landed next. In February 1945, a single photo Recon P-38 Lightning returned from a deep raid near Kobe with 0 escort. 2 zeros down, and a cockpit recording that showed one thing, a feigned stall turn, inverted, followed by a snap climb. The pilot had trained under VF-19. He never mentioned Frank's name, but the fingerprints were there. Unofficially, instructors began using Frank's footage as an example of angle collapse theory, a term made up to justify what was, in essence, visual deception. Fighter Training Command reviewed the tape. No memo was released, but requests for the reel spiked. By war's end, 5 different squadrons, 2 Navy, 1 Marine, 2 Army Air Forces had listed condition bait as an internal code name. It was never approved, never taught in manuals, but it was used because it worked. And Frank. He stayed at base, reassigned to logistics, writing fuel reports for the last 3 months of the war. Not one officer debriefed him. Not one medal was awarded. But the Hellcat he flew. It racked up 6 more kills before it was retired. Pilots started calling it the Ghost. Not because it was lucky, but because you never saw it win. After the war, Frank Hayward returned to California, took a job in civil engineering, and never spoke of the stall climb again. When asked if he saw combat, he'd only nod and say, "Some recon, nothing fancy." He passed away in 1992. No published record mentioned his flight, no citations, no medals, no formal doctrine named him. But among post-war instructors at Pensacola, a quiet phrase lingered in training halls: play dumb, climb smart. It referred to one thing: condition bait. The Hellcat he flew. Bureau number 40877 was scrapped for parts in 1946. Its flight logs lost. But fragments of its gun camera footage, especially the stall inversion sequence, remained in informal instructor reels passed between squadrons into the 1950s. By then, air combat had changed. Jets had replaced props. Radar replaced eyesight. But one truth survived: the pilot who looks helpless isn't always losing. Condition bait was never written into doctrine, but it lived on, unnamed, taught through anecdotes and warning tales. Every pilot trained to know that sometimes what looks like a mistake is bait. Sometimes the stall is on purpose, and sometimes the one you ignore is setting the hook. Frank never asked for recognition, but the tactic he pioneered by accident, in fear and in silence, outlived both the Hellcat and the war. Your mission: spot the angle shift before it's too late. Someone else may already be climbing.